Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Green Ergonomics, a global perspective on the wind energy sector. Does experience matter? I am Catherine Brookman, Associate Director, Knowledge Transfer and Exchange, and on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us today for this free webinar. Just a note that the weather abroad for our presenters is precarious today, so if there are connectivity issues, please stay connected. We appreciate your patience with us. This webinar is the second webinar in the Wind Energy webinar series offered by CRE-MSD with the assistance of our health and safety partners, Angela Cameron from Workplace Safety and Prevention Services and Dean Dunn from the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association. We are grateful to the Ontario Ministry of Labour's Training and Skills Development for our funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and to our presenters who provide their expertise. We are using a new webinar presentation platform, and therefore we ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the webinar. To mute yourself, please use the microphone icon in the floating control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. Click on it to ensure it is muted. The format of today's webinar is as follows. I will briefly introduce you to our speakers. The presentation will be given, after which time we will have 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. We ask that you type your questions into the chat box, and I will relay your questions or their themes should there be duplications to our presenters for them to respond to. The chat box can be pulled up on your screen by selecting the chat icon in the floating control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat feature to communicate during the webinar. Should you have a pressing question that cannot wait until the end of the presentation, such as a technology glitch, please type this into the chat box and we will do our best to address it right away. We will be providing you with a copy of the presentation shortly after the webinar, along with an evaluation that we encourage you to complete to assist us in the delivery of future webinars. This webinar is recorded, therefore, we ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the webinar. Thank you again for joining us. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our three presenters. B. Hildenbrand joined the Energy Institute in 2010 as a technical manager, environment and health, a manager of offshore wind, global offshore wind health and safety, and onshore wind health and safety organization, working together with industry on their health and safety work program. She has a Master's of Science in Environmental Sciences and is a research associate in atmospheric research and climate modeling at the German Aerospace Center. Gemma Milligan is an occupational physiologist specializing in physical employment standards. Gemma is a senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth in the UK, working as a member of the world-renowned Extreme Environments Laboratory. Her work focuses on determining and examining the physical capabilities required to work in demanding occupations while ensuring individuals have the attributes to undertake these roles. To support this avenue of research, Gemma also works as a strength and conditioning coach. She completed her PhD in fitness standards for the Coast Guard Agency and oil and gas industry in 2013. Her research has been in the area of occupational physiology, working with companies, the military, oil and gas, offshore wind, and emergency services. Finally, Joseph O'Haran is a senior lecturer in human movement science at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. He is a biomechanist specializing in the coupling of biological systems. His current research interests are primarily focused on the use of dynamical systems theory methods in the evaluation of metabolic cost of movement patterns. He completed his PhD in artificial neural network analysis of motor skill performance in 2009. His subsequent research has been in the area of biomechanics, working with offshore wind and emergency services. It is now my pleasure to turn this presentation over to our presenters. Over to you.
Many thanks, Catherine, for the nice introduction. And yes, we are delighted to be able to present today at this webinar. And Catherine introduced the speakers. What I would like to do is to inform you that the presentation is split into 3 parts, which I kick off with providing framework information for health and safety in offshore and onshore wind by introducing the organizations G+ and SafteyOn and their connection to the work the University of Portsmouth is doing in their research activities. So G+ is the global offshore wind health and safety organization and was founded on an initiative of 9 offshore wind developers and officially launched in 2012, so formally known as the G9. Main objective is to deliver world-class health and safety performance in the industry. Activity started in the UK and Europe, massively or quite supported by the regulator in the UK, HSE UK, but soon expanded beyond Europe as members operate internationally and now also located in the APAC region. And very lately, we are engaging in North America market with a planned focal group to set up in the US. SafteyOn has been launched only last year, of 2019 as a separate organization, but with the same aim as J+, but looking after the onshore industry. The focus is currently on the UK only, but this might also develop similar in a similar manner like G+ did to become more international. But for now, it's for the UK only. Both organizations' aim is to ensure transparency about the industry's health and safety performance, as well as by assisting industry stakeholders to see that the key emerging risks are mitigated through cooperation and shared learning within industry. Both organizations are run in partnership with the Energy Institute, the EI, which provides the secretariat and supports the work and SafteyOn. So, for example, all the secretarial staff are employed by the Energy Institute. The EI is a chartered professional membership body bringing energy expertise together. The G+ has currently 9 members. Full membership is open to offshore wind asset owners, project developers who are the lead operators or operators with projects at an advanced stage of development, and also the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs of offshore wind turbine generators. There is also associate memberships to engage more closely with the slightly smaller players in the market and also service providers. So these include developers and non-lead offshore wind farmers, transition network operators. The membership is expected to grow over the time, especially in the new areas we're exploring. So like I said, in the APAC region, as well as in North America, with local partners and other stakeholders in the supply chain. Compared to G+, the membership for SafteyOn shows a broader variety of different size players, what is characteristics for the sector in the UK. So currently there are 17 Tier 1 members, including owners and developers, also OEMs and service providers. These Tier 1 members are complemented by 20+ smaller so-called Tier 2 members that are below the 200 megawatt capacity that are not listed here. In the following slide, I would like to give an overview of the setup of the organization. So the overall aim of both organizations is to work jointly together to tackle health and safety issues in the wind industry. And they do it in a 4 main pillar work program. So the first main pillar are the health and safety statistics. The backbone of the work is the incident data collected by our members. So all G+ and SafteyOn members provide their health and safety incident data for all their offshore and onshore wind farms across the world for G+ and for the UK for SafteyOn. The data cover all phases of development to decommissioning, from developing stage to decommissioning stage. We analyze the data to monitor performance and trends and identify risks for industry. Areas of higher risks identified in the incident data from the evidence base for the work program in both organizations. The second pillar are the good practice guidelines. So driven by the incident data, we take a focused approach to deliver the right guidance for the industry. We produce good practice guidelines on areas identified as high risks. By drawing knowledge and expertise from members, subject matter experts, academia, regulators, and industry stakeholders, we are able to put together robust guidance for the industry. The third pillar is a Safe by Design workshop or Safe by Design program. This brings together experts for the purpose of getting the best practice in health and safety into design. So specific topics which are identified again by the high risk profile in the data, input from members and wider industry are investigated with the objective of making improvements at the design stage that will help to reduce incidents throughout the life cycle of a wind farm. Safe by Design workshops review the current design controls and potential failures, identify opportunities for improvement, and demonstrate the potential for risk reduction. The outputs from workshops are published in a report and made freely available via the website. They include recommendations for improvements. And the last pillar is that G+ is using Toolbox to share learnings from real-life incidents, hazards, and safety-critical tasks with the wider offshore industry. So Toolbox is freely available as a web application which holds incidents, lessons, and safety information. It was developed by the Energy Institute and the oil and gas industry, but now G+ actually became a new member of this consortium, providing lessons learned for offshore wind and cross-learnings within the energy sector. Whilst in the early years of G+, safety actually dominated in the work. With the work, for example, undertaken working at height, safe management of small service vessels, dropped objects, access, egress to the wind turbines. But with the years, the focus shifted more and more also to the health area. After, for example, fatality in onshore wind, in an onshore wind turbine service lift in Germany in 2015, and the consequential ban of service lifts for a certain time also for offshore installations, ladder climbing became a pressing issue and concern for industry. So the EI, who had already excellent experience with University of Portsmouth in the development of a recommended physical fitness standard for the oil and gas industry, provided the contact to G+, and actually they got this project in the tender process to undertake research study on a detailed ergonomic assessment of ladder climbing. The purpose or main aim of the studies were to identify the risks to wind turbine technicians, determine an ergonomic assessment of repeated ladder climbing, and to assess the effect of experience. This report was published via the G+ in 2018. But obviously ladder climbing is not the only task in the very demanding job working in an offshore and onshore wind. So mapping of physical requirements and the development of a health standard came into focus of the G+ as an increasing issue for industry. So this formed the base of a work stream that is active in the G+. And the variety, because the background for this is that the variety of medical and physical fitness standards currently applied in the international offshore and onshore wind industry leads to uncertainty and potential risk for health and safety in the sector. Therefore, the main objective of doing this work is to ensure everybody involved, and in particular our technicians, are free of medical conditions that could become a threat to themselves or others. So also we wanted to be sure that they have the physical fitness capability to perform the specific task within their individual roles. And this includes cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, and endurance and mobility. This slide shows the components of the G+ workstream, which involved work undertaken by the Energy Institute Health and Technical Committee on the medical side, Ørsted, one of the G+ members, on the mapping of physical exposure and capacity, and in the main bit, the work University of Portsmouth is doing for us on the physical capacity evaluation, which is undertaken in 3 phases, as Dr. Gemma Milligan is now going to present in a bit more detail. Over to you, Gemma.
Hi, Gemma, you might be on mute.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you, Beata. As Beata said, we're involved in a larger project looking at the medical and physical capability of technicians working in the offshore industry. This is a 3-phase project, and today I'm going to talk specifically about the physical capability assessments. Currently, we are in the early stages of this process, and I'm going to talk to you specifically today about the job task analysis for technicians in the offshore wind industry. When we look at a job task analysis, this is the fundamental building block in the establishment of any physical employment standard and subsequent physical capability assessments. What we look to do here is establish the most physically demanding tasks associated with the job. When we look at this, we can split them down into 2 areas. Those jobs that are considered generic, so for example, in the wind industry, this could be something like hydraulic torque tensioning. We then also identified those tasks which are considered essential. And an essential task is something that may not occur regularly and may be very rare. But when it does occur, individuals have to have the physical capability to undertake that task. And an example of this is something like a casualty evacuation. Now, when we undertake the job task analysis, we gather and organise documentation and identify job specifications. We also consult with subject matter experts who have the ability to identify different aspects of the job that have the physical demand. And what that leads to is not only identifying these generic and essential tasks, but also the requirements placed on the workers, which allows us to look at the physical abilities involved in the job, but also what we have to be aware of some of the ergonomic parameters that may affect these physical demands. Now, as I said, we're undertaking phase 1 at the moment, which is the job task analysis, where we're looking at the most physically demanding tasks associated with just wind technicians. Now, importantly, what we're looking at is we're looking at this from a global perspective, but also across different turbines. Now, the importance of why we're looking across different turbines hopefully will become apparent as we move through the presentation. But when we look at obtaining a job task analysis, there are many different methods in which we can use. And we use a series of methods to make sure that we get both a subjective and an objective appraisal of the job. We used as a starting block for this piece of research some previous analysis that we undertook at the university. And this was looking at ladder climbing. And Joseph is going to present in the third stage of this presentation on the effects of ladder climbing. But when we were putting this project together, we realised that it was the impact that ladder climbing had on other aspects of the job that was important. And so we needed to understand what jobs were being undertaken. So we did a small task analysis based on the 3.6 megawatt turbine. And this involved consultation with 9 subject matter experts. They identified 5 tasks which they considered to be the most physically demanding. Now, the first one isn't specific to working onshore, as this is transferring from land via the ocean onto the turbine. The other 4, however, may be familiar to those working in the onshore industry. And these include hydraulic torque tensioning, ladder climbing, casualty rescue, and manoeuvring through hatches. Using these tasks as the basis, we've now started to move on to perform semi-structured interviews and focus groups with subject matter experts. And when we talk about subject matter experts, we consider those to be individuals undertaking the job, those that have experience in delivering training or coming up with and writing the approved procedures for the job, also those individuals in a managerial role, or those that have had experience working in emergency situations. We are also very lucky to be working closely with the manufacturers of the turbines. And what this does is provide us with a level of objective data where they can give us specific design specifications that will allow us to work out how far individuals will have to climb, and when our subject matter experts report having to work in a tight, restricted space, what the dimensions of that space actually is. We also go through and review the approved working procedures and observe through video when technicians actually performing the task. And this is probably the best part of my job. When anyone ever asks me, this is what I say the best part is. We as the research team actually perform the tasks. Now, currently due to COVID-19, that has been restricted somewhat, but we hope to be able to pick this up in the new year. But as we go through, it's important to look at the demographic that we're dealing with. Currently, we're obtaining information across 6 countries and 40 sites. And when we look at the type of turbines that are being used, if you refer to the pie chart in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see that over 50% are what we deem legacy turbines. And these legacy turbines are older turbines and they're much smaller, and they're the 3.6 megawatts and down. In the newer sites, what we're seeing is much larger turbines being implemented. Now, what we have to be aware of is these changes in design of the turbines will ultimately impact and change the physical demands placed on service technicians. And what we're seeing from initial results is that those individuals having to work on the smaller turbines, so from the 3.6 megawatts down, are facing much higher postural demands than those working on the larger turbines. However, when we look at the larger turbines, that comes with things like larger tower sizes, so more climbing, larger blades, so more bolts that individuals have to then hydraulic torque tension. So although the tasks that may be identified going forward are the same, the physical demands may be affected by the type of turbine that individuals are working on. The other aspect that we need to consider is the environmental conditions. Now, Professor Mike Tickton is actually going to provide a presentation on this in a few weeks' time that is going to be the 3rd in the Wind Energy Series seminar. And he's going to talk specifically about working in the heat and how to manage this additional stress. So as we go through and actually look at what has been determined as the generic and essential tasks so far, we can see that when we look at wind technicians, we have 2 distinct groups. These are our service technicians that will perform the routine maintenance on the turbines, and during one day they will stay on one turbine. We also have the troubleshooters who will move between up to 3 turbines in a day and be responsible for fixing problems as they occur. Now, the impact this will have on the individuals is that there is different physical demands placed on them based on the tasks that they've highlighted. So if you look at the list, the service technicians are tending to highlight the most physically demanding tasks as those with a postural component, whereas the troubleshooters are highlighting those tasks that have a significant manual handling aspect. But between the two, there are generic tasks, and we can see this list reported on the right-hand side. Now, these are tasks that have been highlighted by technicians working in the offshore industry. But if we look back to the presentation that Stephen gave a few weeks ago, we can see that the tasks that are being highlighted as the most physically demanding offshore are also the tasks that are being highlighted as those that aggravate discomfort within onshore workers. So, for example, the changing of components, the torque and tensioning, climbing, and the postural demands that we've already mentioned. But as we go through a task analysis, one of the key things we do is try and gather as much detail about the task as we can. And this includes understanding the frequency and duration that tasks are performed, the distances that individuals may travel during the working day, the equipment that's being used and the loads that individuals may have to lift or wear and maneuver, the method of best practice for performing the task, and then the physical fitness components associated with those job roles. And if we look at the slide in front of us, we can see that there are 4 key aspects of physical fitness that we need to consider. The tasks underneath have been highlighted by the technicians in order of their physical demand. So the ones at the top being the most physical demanding within that particular fitness component. When we look at the cardiovascular component, we often explain this to the technicians as, when you're doing the task, are you out of breath? How out of breath are you when you finish doing the task? And we can see no matter what size the turbine, ladder climbing always comes out on top as the most physically demanding. Secondly, again, not taking into account turbine size, because this appears to be irrelevant, is the casualty rescue is the most physically demanding from a cardiovascular perspective. When we look at muscular strength, we're referring to the ability to be able to lift and maneuver in a short period of time heavier pieces of kit. And we can see that between the troubleshooters and the service technicians, the casualty rescue is reported the highest across all turbine sizes. But then you can see that the troubleshooters then rate 3 jobs that they have to undertake higher than any others that the service technicians then do as well. When we look at muscular endurance, this is the repetitive nature of doing a job. So repetitive lifting or repetitive movement with some kind of muscular fatigue occurring. And we can see that the top task here highlighted is hydraulic torque and tensioning, closely followed by ladder climbing. When we move over to postural demands, we can see that this is the area that is most affected by the size of the turbine. As we move up the turbine sizes, tasks like working restricted areas like under the generator essentially disappear. And what we see is that in the larger turbines, it may be working at shoulder height rather than having to crawl in a small space and be working in a crouched position. But if we compare this again, our offshore result, to what Steve presented from his onshore results, we can start seeing the similarities again. When rated to highlight the 3 most physically difficult tasks that onshore workers and technicians had to highlight, again, they are very similar: climbing, torque tensioning, manual handling, changing components, and postural demands. But it's interesting that we can see differences already occurring between onshore and offshore. One example is here. So one of the statements provided to Stephen was looking at climbing with safety gear of up to £50. When we look at our offshore workers, we see that that climbing gear is reduced down to half of that, which is £25. So although they're undertaking the same jobs as climbing or torque tensioning, the equipment that could be used is very different and ultimately will change the physical demand. But what are the next steps in our piece of work? Well, we're now starting to work directly with the manufacturers to actually now put the objective relevance to the subjective tasks that have been highlighted. We're looking at the specific loads that are being lifted and the differences that are now apparent between the turbines. We're also making sure that across sites that have the same turbines, we're validating the results to make sure that we have parity where we need it. But what this allows us to do is to move into phase 2, which is to actually assess and measure the physical demands associated with these tasks highlighted. And we can do that by measuring the forces that are needed to be applied and also to measure the aerobic cardiovascular fitness that is needed in examples such as ladder climbing. Having done this, what we can then do is apply the job task analysis. Now we're looking at this specifically for this project in the aspect of employee selection and developing physical capability assessments. Now, the clear thing that's become clear already in this early stage is that that will need to be modular. It is not appropriate to say that someone working on a 3.6 megawatt will require the same physical capability as someone working on an 8 megawatt. So there will be components that may be the same, but other aspects will be specific to that turbine. And we can do that through 2 methods. The first one is a direct task simulation. So actually get individuals to do the task, display that they have the competency in that task. The second one is to use a predictive selection test. And an example of this is something like a step test, where we take heart rate to predict someone's ability to climb a ladder. But a job task analysis isn't only suitable for employee selection. It can also be used to improve job design and aid in the assessment of the most appropriate and efficient use of kit. It can aim and assist in designing training programs that maintain fitness for technicians working offshore. But ultimately, what we've seen in the past is by implementing a task analysis and using it in employee selection, we see a reduction in injury of workers. We see the numbers of days that are being lost to injury reduced. We have an objective measure for return to work. But overall, we see operational effectiveness increase. So that just leaves me to say thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. And I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Joseph O'Halloran. He is working specifically looking, and we have done a project looking at ladder climbing, whereby we looked at endurance and also the difference between novice and experienced climbers. So Joseph, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I will now give you a brief overview of the study that Gemma, Professor Mike Tipton and I conducted, specifically focusing on the effects of ladder climbing in the offshore wind industry. Within this study, we first examined the existing literature on ladder climbing and the effects of this activity on the human body, and then conducted our own empirical study in our laboratory here in Portsmouth using wind turbine technicians. The literature review is particularly important given how new this area is, especially from a research perspective. We initially focused on wind turbine technicians, but in the absence of these studies, we looked at other occupations that involved ladder climbing. Due to a limited number of studies pertaining to these areas, we also looked at non-industry-based participants. The 2 boxes on the top you see, biomechanical, were considered first. In particular, studies related to force produced in the arms and legs, EMG analysis of muscle activity, joint range of motion studies from a biomechanical perspective, and then studies relating to oxygen consumption, energy expenditure, and grip strength from a physiological perspective were considered. 34 relevant journal papers were found. However, few studies that specifically related to the physiological analysis of wind turbine technicians, and no studies that related to the biomechanical analysis of wind turbine technicians were found. Specific groups that were found were coal miners, armed force personnel, firefighters, the offshore oil and gas industry, and construction workers. And here we see some of our key results, and I've broken these down into 4 main areas where we found sufficient literature to help to advise us. The first area is the hand positioning. When using the ladder, the turbine technicians can choose between grasping the vertical rails of the ladder or the rungs. It has been shown that grasping the ladder rails cause significant changes in the biomechanics of climbing and can influence the likelihood and recovery from slipping or preventing a fall. Grasping the rungs may provide a better grip than grasping the rails and thus help prevent falls. From another perspective, if somebody does fall from a ladder, holding on to the rungs gives them a better chance to reattach to the ladder. So holding the rungs can help prevent it, but can also help a wind turbine technician to reattach if they are decoupled from the ladder. The second aspect we looked at was toe clearance, and this is highlighted from a slip perspective, or slip risk perspective. Although no minimum toe clearance space exists in the wind power industry, it has been examined in other industries. For example, the US Mining Safety and Health Administration requires that ladders be at least 76 millimeters away from other surfaces. The US Occupational Health and Safety Administration requires 180 millimeter clearance. Literature has shown that when toe clearance is restricted, there's up to 6 times more likely to be a slip due to making contact with the underside of the rung as somebody is stepping upwards. The third aspect, the physical demand, specifically relates to the pitch of the ladder. This has not been consistent across the research at all. On the right-hand side, we can see vertical ladders, which are predominantly used within the industry. In this situation, the technician is attached to the ladder with the hands and feet, but the center of mass is behind or outside of the base of support. This increases the demand for climbing, particularly on the shoulders. Allowing the pitch to change, such as a ladder leaning against a wall where we have an angle of the ladder, will allow us to place the center of mass over the base of support and thus reduce the demand of ladder climbing. It has been shown that vertical ladder climbing has higher VO2, higher heart rate response, higher rate of perceived exertion than a ladder pitched at 75 degrees. This is a consideration in the design of the ladders, if possible, to allow a pitch in the ladder will significantly reduce the physical demand of climbing that particular ladder. Although research on physiological demand has been conducted, this has largely been on short vertical ladders, no more than 30 meters long, pitched ladders, ladder ergometers, climbing over short periods of time. It's not generally applicable to the wind power industry or similar industries which require individuals to climb long vertical ladders. And so we have designed the following study conducted here at the University of Portsmouth to help answer some of the questions related to the effect of long-term or long-distance ladder climbing. And here we can see a diagram depicting our particular study. We had 7 wind turbine technicians, and these for the remaining slides are denoted as EC or experienced climbers, and 10 novice climbers, which you will see denoted as NC for the remaining slides. Each undertook 3 120-meter climbs, which, as Gemma mentioned previously, might reflect the maximum amount that they would be expected for the troubleshooters within a particular day. Each of these 120-meter climbs was divided into 4 30-meter climbs, separated by a work schedule of 1-to-1. These were all conducted at self-selected pace and were separated by approximately 1.5 hours. We see a list of our pre-test on the left-hand side. We gathered quite an amount of data within this particular study: height, mass, anthropometric measurements, leg length, blood lactate, grip strength, grip endurance, a manual dexterity test, and some capture of the descent of the ladder. During the test, we gathered VO2 or oxygen and carbon dioxide data continuously, climbing, heart rate data continuously, EMG or muscle activity continuously, kinematic data using our high-speed infrared cameras continuously, rate of perceived exertion at some rest intervals, and grip strength at rest intervals. And we repeated some of our pre-tests in our post-test data at the end of the study. And here we can see a small short video of one of our wind turbine technicians climbing the ergometer within our lab, slightly obscured by some of our cameras, tripods just there. So let's focus in on some of the results, and I'll move on to the practical applications in just a moment. The first result relates to grip strength and endurance. And as Gemma mentioned previously, we're looking at the effect of ladder climbing, but particularly on something that a technician might have to do afterwards. We found no significant difference between our experienced climbers and our novice climbers. However, we did find lower grip strength and endurance scores following each 120-meter climb. Also, these were still significantly lower at the start of the second climb and the start of the third climb. So the effect of the first climb had a knock-on effect on their grip strength before they began their second and third climb. With regard to oxygen consumption, or our VO2 data, our climbers spent significantly less time metabolizing energy aerobically than anaerobically. In climb 2, it was a similar set of data with significantly less time metabolizing energy aerobically than anaerobically. And on the third climb, we found no difference. The demand of the task was extremely high. So this was an extremely challenging task, and I'll come to some of the implications of this a little bit later on. We found no significant difference between our experienced and our novice climbers, but it must be remembered that this was a self-selected pace, and the pace chosen by the novice climbers was slower than the pace chosen by our experienced climbers. If we look at our biomechanical data, we have a large set of data covering the entire body. I'm going to focus in just on some key aspects here. First, we're going to look at the toe, and I've highlighted it with a red circle on the image on the right. Within this, we looked at the distance between the toe and the ladder. So we could create a plane of movement of the ladder with some markers on the ladder. And we look at the distance between that toe and the ladder as the climber continues to fatigue. And as it gets smaller and smaller, the climber is at a greater risk of tripping on the steps or the rungs of the ladder. We found a significant difference over the 3 climbs, irrespective of experience. So both novice and experienced, the distance got smaller over from climb 1 to climb 2, and again onto climb number 3. This highlights that after the first climb, all participants reduced their clearance, making the possibility of clipping the bottom of the rung more likely as they stepped up. We also found a difference between the groups, with my experienced climbers having much greater toe clearance than my non-climbers. This is important for new entrants into the industry from a training perspective. Secondly, we looked at shoulder flexion. In the image, we can see how the arms should be used, reaching in line with the shoulders to grasp the rungs. As our participants became more fatigued, my shoulder flexion increased, so reaching above the shoulder to grasp the rungs rather than directly out in front and laying the hands on the rungs, so reaching to grab the rungs of the ladder. This was found to be significantly different, again, for both groups between climbs 1 to 2 and from 1 to 3. These changing mechanics with increases in shoulder flexion following the first climb are certainly of interest to anybody examining this particular area. And finally, we looked at the hip joint, and really this is to examine the use of the large muscles of the lower body. My experienced climber used a significantly greater range of motion at the hip than my novice climbers. And this difference was evident in all groups, much more efficient at using those large muscles in the lower body. For experienced climbers, they didn't change their hip range of motion between climbs at all, and were able to maintain the use of these large muscles. The novice climbers reduced it after climb 1. So climb 1 had an effect on their ability to use the lower lower limb muscles. We also examined muscle activity, and you'll see some text repeated across the 4 muscles or areas of the body that we looked at. We looked at the forearms, the biceps in the upper arms, anterior deltoids in the shoulder, and the gastrocnemius or calf muscle in the lower leg. And we can see a significant difference in muscle activation between climbs. Again, a single climb had an effect on the amount of muscle activation that we saw. A significant higher amount of muscle activation was found in my non-climbers than my experienced climbers. So my experienced climbers much more efficient in muscle activation. In particular, we noticed the forearm at the top. Anecdotal feedback from all of our participants indicated this was the limiting factor. So forearm fatigue was a limiting factor for all of our participants in their ability to climb, particularly in the later stages of each climb, so from 90 to 120 meters, but also then in climb 2 and climb 3. So let's combine what we saw into some practical considerations. Firstly, the aim was to examine what might happen over a working day, and we can conclude that ascending a 120-meter vertical ladder has a very high physical demand. The speed chosen was a self-selected speed, and the speeds chosen by our participants were greater, so between 30 rungs per minute up to 67, than we see in some of the other recommendations within the oil and gas industry. It may not be suitable to use the exact same recommendations within our wind industry. We also need to consider the use of a vertical ladder and the greater distances that we have covered when comparing to other studies. So no other studies has completed a 120-meter climb, making it a little bit more difficult to compare between studies. From a grip strength perspective, we saw grip strength and endurance pre and post each individual climb, approximately 35 and 26% for strength and endurance. These data, again, are greater than we see in some of the other research that's published, and this has a knock-on effect in the subsequent performance of any motor skills following completion of the climb, and we need to consider the impact of this fatigue on the tasks preceding a ladder climb. We saw changes in the shoulder joint, which suggests as fatigue increased due to multiple climbs, we're reaching higher and grasping tighter with our hand rather than just leaving it on the rungs of the ladder, actually grasping around the rungs of the ladder and suffering from forearm fatigue on this. This is occurring after the first climb. So one single climb causes this effect, and we need to think about this repetitive shoulder movement and an increased risk of chronic shoulder injuries, which has been shown in other non-ladder climbing specific literature. When we examine the experienced versus novice aspect, we can see that experienced climbed faster, took less rest, and had physical, biomechanical and physiological differences between the climbs. Novice climbers had less range of motion through their hips and a higher proportion of muscle activity in the upper body, and using these small muscles in the arms rather than larger muscles. This has a knock-on effect for their ability to work within the industry from the moment that they join, and we need to look at some considerations for training beyond that, and I'll mention that in the next slide. From a practical perspective, a significant increase from climb 1 to climb 2 means that the industry needs to consider what effect this will have and what effect fatigue will have on both chronic overuse injuries and acute injuries following the first individual climb. As a future recommendation perspective, we can see that the ladder climbing technique and experience does improve performance, reduces the physiological burden, and maintains optimal movement patterns for longer. Therefore, when considering future work within this area, we need to evaluate what constitutes an experienced climber. What are the mechanics of an experienced climber in comparison to a novice climber? What is the role that body size plays in climbing ability? And we matched our participants, so our wind turbine technicians and our healthy participants, for fitness levels, so very similar fitness levels, but not very similar climbing fitness levels. And we see a significant difference in their ability to climb. If there is an optimal climbing speed, that might help to reduce forearm fatigue. And we saw quite a few who climbed at a slower speed, having more forearm fatigue from holding on to the ladder. When you think about how we can optimize the climbing ability and therefore minimize the risk of injury, we need to consider how long it takes to become proficient at prolonged ladder climbing using minimal acceptable standards, and if we can provide some training that will help improve this time to proficiency. Here are some useful links which Beata has mentioned at the start of the presentation. And so the G+ SafteyOn and Energy Institute web links, and you also have a couple of research papers published in this area that give much more specifics on the methodologies and some of the data that we talk about today, and they're both available. You can also, of course, ask for information from Gemma, Beata, or myself using any of the email addresses here for further information or any further links to information that you get. On behalf of Beata, Gemma, and myself, I would like to thank the Centre of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD, as Catherine has outlined at the beginning, for inviting us to present this three-part webinar to you today. And I would like in particular to thank Catherine and Bettina, who is helping to host this session today, for all of their help in making this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We really appreciate your kind remarks. And I'd like to thank all of our presenters for an informative, excellent presentation. I hear a little back, so I will just kick off with a question. I think it's really for B, and then I hope to see some questions come in. B, in your presentation, you spoke about a toolbox related to incident learnings. How did you motivate members and industry to share their learnings? And you might have to take yourself off mute.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Catherine, for the question. Actually, that's the sharing of incidents and sharing of learnings from incidents is, I think, the core of the success of organizations like G+ in particular. That's actually was one of the major reasons to set up an organization like G+, to come together with developers, but also with manufacturers, OEMs, and be open about health and safety and about incidents, and get out of these blame and shame kind of culture into an open culture and into a safety culture, and to share learnings. And Toolbox actually provides a really good tool to share incidents in a nice, applicable way. So you can use the information. It's already investigated incidents, so you can actually learn from them, and you can use in Toolbox talks, etc. And it's a really nice example how industry works together.
Thanks for that, B. I asked because we're very keen to get learnings into our MSD prevention guideline. So I will have a more detailed look at your toolbox to see how you have motivated people to provide this information. The next question is for any one of you, and it's related to the physical demands of the job. How are the physical demands of the job of the wind turbine technicians quantified and translated into predictive selection tests?
Hi, thanks, Catherine, for the great question. I'll take this one. So the first part that we're undertaking at the moment is we're understanding the methods of best practice for performing the elements of the job. We know how much equipment is being used and what equipment is being used, and we also know the dimensions in which wind technicians have to perform in. Therefore, what we can do is actually measure them performing these tasks and ascertain different aspects. So, for example, what we can do is to measure the cardiovascular requirement to climb a ladder. Now, what we can ask people to do is we can ask people to do this repeatedly, increasing the intensity each time, and we can then compare this to a result that predicts their maximum capability to exercise, and that allows us to set up a predictive selection test. Now, as I said, there's different ways we can look at assessing individuals. One is using this predictive selection test. So another example is grip strength. So individuals will perform a task such as stretcher carrying up to their maximum capacity. We would then look at their maximum grip strength and look at the association between the two to be able to predict what grip strength you would need to lift the stretcher. Now, this takes a large number of people to build up that relationship, and no prediction is perfect, which is why a number of organisations prefer to use direct task simulations, which are where you get individuals to perform the task, but perhaps with the skill element removed.
Thank you very much for that informative answer. I've noticed that there is some kind of wind in the back, and if anyone has their self off mute, just to encourage you to mute yourself again. Another question, and it could be
Catherine, I believe you've gone onto mute. There you go.
any of you, and you mentioned that experience allows individuals to become more proficient. How is this taken into consideration when determining the suitable physical capability assessments?
Catherine, I'll take this one again. So this is a really interesting question. And if we look across different organisations, we can see different approaches. So especially in the UK, what we see is when there is a skill component in the job where there's a physical capability, for new recruits, they may use physical selection tests more readily, but then as they progress through their career and they gain the training to perform those skill elements, then you can use more direct task simulations that can be built into competency-based training exercises. So one of the key things is that if someone doesn't have the skill to perform the job, that they need to be allowed time either to obtain it, or you remove that skill component from actually the test that you are going to use. So an example of this in torque tensioning perhaps is that an individual would have to be able to show that they could lift the required weight to the level, hold it there for approximately a minute, remove it and repeat it at a number of times that would be suitable to reflect the job demands. Something like ladder climbing, where we see that experience is an important factor, we could use a predictive selections test like the step test, where we could then allow an inexperienced individual then to be trained up to then gain the experience needed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to ask if any of our presenters had anything else that they wanted to add based on the questions that have just been provided, or if there's anything else you wanted to say to our audience. All right. Well, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank our audience for joining us today, especially in the middle of this hot summer. And This was extremely interesting. I do encourage you all to join us for our third wind energy webinar, which will be on heat and fatigue. It'll be August 19th. And if it's anything like today, we will certainly need to learn whatever we can about managing heat and fatigue to prevent MSDs. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you in August.